Second question, who is most associated with each of the following title belts? And if you were on the Facebook group, you saw Sean posting photos of all the different championship belts. And by the way, let's try to be a little more careful when we spam the wall with different posts. I'm not a big fan of that, but without having the visual here for all of you, I will describe each belt. What he wants to know is what name or names do I associate with each of these belts, so I figure I'll run through this really quick. The AWA World Heavyweight Championship, was not a big AWA fan when I was a kid. I've learned more about them and watched more AWA in recent years. And to me, when I think of the AWA title, I think of Nick Bockwinkel more than I even do Vern Gagne. So I associate Bockwinkel with that belt. The WWF Big Gold Eagle belt from the Attitude Era. When I think of that championship, I think of The Rock. That's who I think of. The ECW World Heavyweight Championship, I think of Taz, personally. The NWA WCW Big Gold World Heavyweight Championship belt, there can only be one name, that is Ric Flair. The NWA Big Globe belt from the early 80s and the 70s, I think of Harley Race. The Intercontinental Championship Classic, well, I guess the Intercontinental title design now, they went back to the classic design, which is just confirmation that that design kicked all kinds of ass because they got rid of it and then eventually they went back to it because it's the shit. It's one of my favorite championship designs, right behind the original Winged Eagle. That's an interesting one. The classic Intercontinental title look, I kind of associate three different people with it. I associate Mr. Perfect, Shawn Michaels, and Razor Ramon. Those are the three names that come to mind. I can't just... If I had to just say one, I probably would go with Razor. And he held it more times than the other guys. That's probably why when I think of it, I think of him first. And I was a big Mr. Perfect fan when he held the belt, too. He was, one of my favorite Intercontinental champions to watch. If I had to pick one, I'd go with Razor, but I really want to say all three of them. And Shawn during his first heel run as well. The TNA World Heavyweight Championship, when the company was, as Sean says, in its glory. I think of AJ Styles. That's who I think of when I think of the TNA title. The WCW World Heavyweight Championship post-Big Gold, when Flair took it to WWE. So this would have been in the early 90s, WCW. I think of Big Van Vader. I mean, the guy was a beast. He was one of the best champions that... I mean, you talk about a monster heel champion who could go. That guy could fucking go, man. I mean, he wasn't just some big fat dude that they gave the championship to because he was big or because he was fat or what. I mean, he was a big dude, but he could go. He made it look real. Probably because half the time he really was beating the shit out of his opponents. But find me another guy like him as agile. Find me a guy like him that'll go to the top rope and do a fucking moonsault. You talk about people who don't get enough credit. I don't think Vader gets enough credit. And you talk about a Hall of Fame guy, a guy who should be in the Hall of Fame right now. I think of Big Van Vader. So when I think of that belt, I think of him. The WCW U.S. Championship, I thought about this. I don't really associate it with any one guy. If I had to pick one, maybe Lex Luger, because he held it so many times. He held it like 5 times, I think. So Luger, I'd go with by default, but when I think of the U.S. title, there isn't any one guy that pops into my head. The WWF Winged Eagle belt from the Hogan to Austin era. Who do I associate that with? I associate that with 2 guys. Hulk Hogan's the easy answer, especially since I grew up on him. Hogan, absolutely without question. If you put a gun to my head and said you can only pick one, it's Hulk Hogan. But I also associate that belt with Bret Hart. Bret Hart, to me, did a fine job, I think, of representing that belt as the top guy and having classic matches. And yeah, I think of Hogan and Bret are the 2 guys when I think of that original Winged Eagle belt. And lastly here, the WWE Undisputed Championship from 2002. I think of Brock Lesnar. When I think back to that time period, I think of that belt. I think of that belt around Brock Lesnar's waist, and he wore it well.